My name is Clara. I'm 29 years old, and for my entire adult life, my older brother treated me like the unpaid help while he played the golden family child. I kept telling myself he'd step up when it really mattered. But the moment that finally made the truth impossible to ignore came outside my mother's ICU room. The doctor had just explained the cost of her life-saving surgery. My brother leaned against the sterile white wall, looked right through me, and whispered, "She is already old. Let's just keep her apartment." A passing nurse stopped dead in her tracks, her clipboard dropping an inch. My hands started shaking so hard I had to grip the plastic waiting room chair. He never visited. He never called. He just waited for the inheritance. I thought I was overreacting. I was wrong. He thought he had already won. He had already quietly transferred $142,800 out of her savings account the week before. But he had no idea I had left my phone recording on her hospital bed. When my mother opened her eyes 5 hours later and heard his voice, what happened next didn't just cost him the apartment, it destroyed his perfect reputation forever. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me take you back to 6 months ago, the day my mother first got sick. The first time I realized I was the only one truly steering the ship was in a cramped wood-paneled doctor's office that smelled like old paper and lemon floor wax. My mother sat next to me, her small frame looking even smaller in a heavy wool coat she refused to take off. The oncologist didn't look up from his clipboard when he gave us the diagnosis. Stage 3. Treatment would be aggressive, expensive, and constant. I felt the air leave the room. I reached for my mother's hand, which was cold and shaking. My brother, Julian, wasn't there. He was closing a deal 3 states away, but he made sure to send a massive bouquet of lilies to the house that evening with a card that read, "We're in this together." The lilies died within a week. I was the one who threw them out. Within 48 hours, the reality of being in this together set in. It meant I had to call my supervisor at the logistics firm and beg for a remote shift starting at 4:00 a.m. so I could spend my afternoons driving Mom to chemotherapy. It meant my life became a blur of color-coded pill organizers, insurance claim forms, and the specific, metallic smell of hospital waiting rooms. Julian's contribution was different. He visited exactly once during those first few months. He blew into the house wearing a tailored navy suit, smelling of expensive cologne and success. He spent 20 minutes in Mom's bedroom. I watched from the doorway as he leaned over her bed, adjusted her pillow for the perfect angle, and snapped a selfie of him holding her hand. "Stay strong, Queen," he whispered to her. By the time I finished making him a sandwich he didn't ask for, he was already in his car. An hour later, the photo was on his Instagram. The caption was a paragraph about the sacred bond between a son and his mother, and how family is the only thing that matters when the storm hits. It got 400 likes. Our cousins commented about what a devoted son he was. None of them asked who was changing the bed sheets or tracking the white blood cell counts. I was the one holding the apartment keys. That became my primary identity, the keeper of the keys. I used them to let myself in at 6:00 a.m. to make her oatmeal. I used them to go to the pharmacy at midnight when her nausea got too bad. I used them to lug groceries up the 3 flights of stairs while my own back ached from the physical weight of her declining health. Julian only used his voice. He'd call once a week, usually while he was driving, and ask for a high-level summary of her progress. "How are the numbers, Clara? Give me the bullet points," he'd say. "She's tired, Julian. She's losing weight. I need help with the co-pays for the new medication." "Look, I'm tied up with the firm's expansion right now," he'd snap, his tone shifting from concerned son to annoyed executive. "But let's talk about the apartment. What's the current market value in that zip code? I heard the building next door just converted to luxury condos. We need to think about the long-term asset protection." He didn't ask if she was in pain. He asked about the square footage. I started carrying a permanent knot in my shoulders. I was 29, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone 10 years older. My savings were draining into gas money and specialized organic groceries that Mom could actually keep down. Julian, meanwhile, was posting photos from a charity gala. The unfairness wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, quiet leak. It was the way my aunts would call me to complain that I hadn't updated the family group chat fast enough, while they sent Julian strength and prayers for having to deal with a sick parent from afar. It was the way Mom would light up when he called for 5 minutes, completely forgetting that I had just spent 6 hours cleaning the bathroom after she got sick. I didn't complain. I thought that's just how families worked. There's the one who does the work and the one who gets the credit. I figured as long as Mom was cared for, the rest didn't matter. Then came the Tuesday morning when everything broke. I walked into her room with a cup of tea and found her gray-faced and barely breathing. The slow leak of her illness had turned into a flood. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and rain hitting the back windows. By the time we reached the ICU, she was unconscious. I stood in the hallway, clutching my phone, waiting for Julian to answer. When he finally did, his first question wasn't about her vitals. "Is she stable enough to sign anything?" he asked. I hung up. I realized then that I wasn't just carrying the physical load of her care. I was carrying the weight of a brother who was already measuring the drapes in a home where our mother was still trying to live. The ICU felt like a different planet. Everything was too bright, too cold, and filled with the rhythmic whistling of the ventilators. I sat in a plastic chair by my mother's bed for 18 hours straight, watching the monitors. Her skin looked like parchment. Every time a nurse walked in, my heart lunged into my throat, waiting for the news that she was gone. Around 3:00 a.m. on the second day, a doctor with deep circles under his eyes pulled me into the hallway. He told me the situation was critical. There was a specific surgical intervention that could clear the blockage and stabilize her heart, but it was a specialized procedure. Because of her age and the complexity, the hospital's billing department needed a confirmed financial commitment or a significant deposit to move forward with the surgical team. "She has insurance," I said, my voice cracking. "It covers the basics," he replied gently, "but the specialized equipment and the out-of-network surgical lead. We're looking at a substantial gap. Does she have savings?" I knew she did. My father had left her well provided for, and she lived a frugal life in that apartment. I told the doctor I would handle it immediately. I went back into her room and found her tablet in her overnight bag. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type in her passcode. I knew where she kept her digital records. I logged into her primary savings account, expecting to see the $160,000 safety net she had talked about for years. The screen loaded, my breath hitched. The balance was $2,400. I refreshed the page. I thought it was a glitch, a mobile banking error, but the number stayed the same. I scrolled down to the transaction history, my eyes darting through the lines of text. There it was. 5 days ago, while I was at the pharmacy picking up her morphine, a single outgoing wire transfer had been initiated. The amount was exactly $142,800. The recipient wasn't a hospital or a pharmacy. It was JM Holdings LLC, Julian's initials. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in the glass of the ICU window. The room felt like it was spinning. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't Julian protecting the assets from a tax hike. This was Julian emptying our mother's life savings while she lay in a hospital bed, unable to speak. He had used the power of attorney she'd given him years ago, the one he'd insisted on because he was the businessman of the family, to strip her of her only chance at survival. The cost was suddenly, brutally real. Without that money, the surgery wouldn't happen. The hospital wasn't a charity, they needed the funds to secure the specialists. By taking that money, Julian hadn't just stolen a future inheritance. He had effectively signed Mom's death warrant. I tried to call him. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I sent a text. The hospital needs the money for Mom's surgery. I saw the transfer to your LLC. Send it back now. He didn't reply for 20 minutes. When he finally did, it was a short, cold text. I'm managing the estate's liquidity to prevent it from being eaten by medical debt. Don't be emotional, Clara. I'll be there in the morning to discuss the next steps with the doctors. Next steps? He meant funeral arrangements. He was already treating her like a closed file. I looked at my mother. She was still in there, her chest rising and falling with the help of a machine. She had worked 40 years as a school teacher to save that money. She had stayed in that drafty apartment, never buying new clothes, never taking vacations, just so she'd never be a burden to us. And in her moment of greatest need, her son had reached into her pocket and taken the very air she needed to breathe. I realized then that my financial security was gone, too. I had spent my own meager savings on her daily care, thinking the big stuff was covered. I had nothing left to give the hospital. I was a 29-year-old with a dying mother and a brother who was actively looting the wreckage. I walked over to the sink in the corner of the room and splashed cold water on my face. The nurse came in to check the IV drip. She looked at me with pity, probably thinking I was just another grieving relative. She had no idea she was looking at a woman whose brother had just turned a medical emergency into a heist. I didn't tell her. I couldn't even form the words yet. I just watched the little green line on the heart monitor. Every beat felt like a countdown. Julian thought he was being smart. He thought he was securing the bag before the hospital could get their hands on it. He didn't care that the bag was the only thing keeping Mom's heart beating. That was the first time I felt a different kind of coldness settle over me. It wasn't the coldness of grief or fear. It was the coldness of a person who realizes they are being hunted by their own blood. I looked at the tablet again. $142,800, a specific, jagged number. I took a screenshot of the transfer. I emailed it to my personal account. I BCC'd my work email. Then I tucked the tablet back into the bag. My brother was coming in the morning to handle it. He had no idea I had already seen the hole he dug. I stayed awake the rest of the night, holding Mom's hand. It felt thinner than it had yesterday. I kept thinking about the selfie Julian took. I kept thinking about how he smiled for the camera while he was likely already planning the wire transfer. He had played the part of the grieving son so perfectly that even I had wanted to believe him. But numbers don't lie. And as the sun began to rise over the parking lot outside, I knew that the devoted son was just a mask for a man who was waiting for his mother to become an estate. I wasn't just her daughter anymore. I was the only thing standing between Julian and the finality he was so clearly hoping for. I knew he'd arrive with a script. He'd be polished. He'd be reasonable. He'd talk about quality of life and letting go. And I knew that if I didn't find a way to stop him, he'd walk away with the apartment and the cash, and I'd be left with nothing but the memory of how I let him do it. That wasn't going to happen. By 9:00 a.m., the hospital felt like a pressure cooker. The surgical coordinator had already called twice, asking if we had clarified the financial arrangements. Each time, I told them my brother was on his way. I felt like a liar, but I was desperate to keep her on the schedule. I knew that if we missed this window, her heart wouldn't hold out for another. Julian arrived at 10:15 a.m. He didn't come in running or breathless. He walked in with a leather briefcase and a coffee from the expensive place across the street. He looked like he was heading into a board meeting, not a death watch. He didn't even look at Mom first. He looked at the monitors, then at me. "You look like hell, Clara," he said, setting his coffee on the rolling tray table where her water used to sit. "You need to go home and shower. I'll take it from here." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Did you bring the money, the $142,800 you moved out of her account?" He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just leaned back against the windowsill and sighed, the way a teacher sighs at a student who can't grasp a simple math problem. "I told you, that's about asset protection," he said quietly. "If the hospital sees that kind of liquid cash, they'll drain it before she even hits the operating table. I've moved it into a protected LLC structure to ensure we have something left for her long-term care or for the estate. It's the responsible thing to do." "The surgery is her care, Julian. If she doesn't get it today, there is no long-term." "The doctors are being aggressive because they want the billing," he countered, his voice dropping into that smooth, persuasive tone he used on his clients. "Clara, look at her. She's 82. Do you really want to put her through a major thoracic procedure just to buy her 3 more months of being tethered to a machine? It's selfish. You're holding on for you, not for her." He was standing there, holding her life savings in a digital vault, telling me I was the selfish one. He was literally using her own money to pay for his car lease and his office rent while her heart was failing 10 feet away. "It's her money," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's her life. Give it back." "No," he said. The word was flat and final. "I am the executor designate and I have the POA. I've already consulted with a friend of mine in medical law. We are well within our rights to seek a palliative path if the cost-to-benefit ratio of surgery is this lopsided. I'm not letting you blow the entire family legacy on a lost cause." The family legacy. He meant the apartment. He meant the high 6-figure payout he was expecting once she was gone. I realized then that Julian wasn't just being a jerk, he was actively managing her death. He had calculated that her life was worth less than the $142,800 and the equity in the 2-bedroom on 4th Street. I begged him. I actually got down on my knees at one point, right there in the ICU, because I didn't know what else to do. I told him I'd sign over my half of the inheritance if he just paid for the surgery. I told him he could have everything later if he'd just let her have now. He just checked his watch. "I have a conference call at 11. Think about what I said, Clara. Stop being the martyr and start being a realist." He walked out to the waiting area to take his call. I stood there, looking at my mother. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to sit down on the edge of her bed. I was losing. He had the law, he had the money, and he had the cold-blooded patience of a vulture. I looked at my phone. I had been using it to track her vitals and take notes on what the doctors said. I realized I needed a record of what he was saying to me, because no one would believe it. Our aunts, our cousins, the neighbors, they all thought he was the hero. I opened the voice memo app. I felt a sudden, frantic idea. The doctors were coming back in 20 minutes to do the final family consult before they officially pulled her from the surgical list. Julian would be back in the room then. He'd play the part of the grieving, pragmatic son again. I leaned over and tucked my phone under the corner of my mother's pillow, right near her ear. The case was dark, and the pillowcase had a fold that hid it perfectly. I hit record. "I'm going to talk to the billing office one more time," I whispered to her, though I knew she couldn't hear me. "I'm going to try to buy us an hour." I left the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I walked past Julian in the hallway, he was laughing at something on his headset, twirling a pen between his fingers. He didn't even look up. He thought the game was already over. He thought he had already won. I went to the billing office and cried. I told them my brother was processing the wire and it was just taking time. I was lying, and I think the woman behind the desk knew it, but she gave me a look of such deep, weary sympathy that she promised not to call the surgical lead for another 45 minutes. I walked back toward the ICU, my legs feeling like lead. I had no plan. I had no money. All I had was a phone recording silence in a room where my mother was dying, and my brother was waiting for the clock to run out. I didn't know then that the most important conversation of my life was about to happen while I wasn't even in the room. The hallway outside the ICU felt like a tunnel. The air conditioning was humming, a constant, low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. I leaned against the cold wall, checking my watch every 30 seconds. I had 45 minutes to find a miracle, or the surgical team would be reassigned to someone whose family wasn't fighting over the bill. I saw the lead surgeon, Dr. Aris, walking toward our station. He had a look of professional exhaustion that usually preceded bad news. He gestured for me and Julian to join him near the nursing station. Julian closed his briefcase with a sharp click and stepped over, his expression shifting instantly into a mask of somber concern. "Mr. and Miss Sterling," the doctor said, looking between us. "The window is closing. We've cleared the OR for 2:00 p.m., but the administration hasn't seen the deposit. Beyond the logistics, we need a final decision on the directive. If we don't proceed, we'll move to comfort care by evening." I opened my mouth to speak, to beg for one more hour, but Julian stepped in front of me. He put a hand on the doctor's shoulder, a familiar, patronizing gesture. "Dr. Aris, we've been talking it over," Julian said, his voice dropping into a gentle, tragic register. "Clara is understandably emotional. She's been here around the clock and isn't seeing the forest for the trees, but I have to think about our mother's dignity." He paused, looking down at his expensive shoes as if he were weighing the soul of the universe. He leaned back against the sterile white wall, the very image of a burdened son making the hard choice. "She is already old," Julian whispered, loud enough for the passing staff to hear. "She's had a good life. Why put her through the trauma of a surgery she might not survive just to drain the estate? Honestly, let's just keep her apartment. It's what she would have wanted, to leave us something stable rather than a pile of medical debt for a few extra weeks of suffering." The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. Let's just keep her apartment. A few feet away, a nurse in blue scrubs was walking by with a metal clipboard. She stopped dead in her tracks. I heard the sharp clack of the clipboard hitting her hip as her hand slipped an inch. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated disgust. She was a professional who saw death every day, but even she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Julian didn't even notice her. He was too busy looking right through me, his eyes cold and transactional. He wasn't even pretending anymore. To him, our mother was already a line item he was ready to cross off the ledger. "You're a monster," I said. My hands started shaking so hard I had to grip the back of a nearby plastic waiting room chair just to stay upright. "I'm a realist, Clara," he snapped, his grieving son mask slipping for a split second. "Go get some coffee. You're becoming hysterical." He turned on his heel and walked toward the elevators, pulling out his phone to take another business call. He didn't look back. He didn't go into the room to say goodbye. He just left. I stood there for a long time, the nurse's gaze still burning into the side of my head. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my gut. He had said it, out loud, in a public hallway. He had traded her heartbeat for a piece of real estate on 4th Street. I walked back into the ICU room. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hiss-click of the ventilator. I reached under the pillow and pulled out my phone. My fingers were numb as I swiped to stop the recording. I didn't listen to it yet. I couldn't. I just held the device against my palm, feeling the heat of the battery. I realized I hadn't just caught a conversation, I had caught a confession. While I was in the billing office lying for him, he had been standing 10 feet away from her bed, negotiating the price of her death. I looked at the heart monitor. The little green line was still moving. She was still fighting, even if the person who was supposed to protect her had already given up. I sat down in the chair and stared at the door. Julian thought he had closed the deal. He thought the hysterical sister would eventually fold, the mother would pass away quietly, and he'd walk into the lawyer's office next week to claim his prize. He had no idea that for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the useful one who just took the hits. The nurse who had dropped her clipboard poked her head into the room. She didn't say anything at first. She just checked the IV bag, her movements sharp and deliberate. Then she looked at me, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I saw someone acknowledge the truth of what was happening in this family. "I heard him," she whispered, her voice tight. "In the hall, I heard what he said." "I know," I said. "I'm so sorry," she added. She lingered for a second, then walked out, leaving me alone with the recording and the woman who had spent 30 years telling me that Julian was the golden child who would one day take care of us both. I looked at the phone. It was just a piece of plastic and glass, but in that moment, it felt like the only weapon I had ever owned. Julian wanted the apartment. He wanted the $142,800. He wanted the reputation of the grieving, successful son. He was about to find out that some things aren't for sale. The nurse came back into the room 10 minutes later. Her name tag said Sarah. She didn't go to the monitors this time. She went straight to the small whiteboard on the wall where the daily goals were written. She wiped away stabilize and wrote pending decision in jagged, angry letters. Then she turned to me, her arms crossed over her chest. "I've been on this floor for 8 years, Sarah said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "I've seen families fight over jewelry and cars while someone is still in the bed, but I've never heard someone say keep the apartment while their sister was begging for a surgery. It made my stomach turn." "He thinks he's being smart," I said, my voice sounding hollow in my own ears. "He thinks he's protecting the money." "It's not his money to protect," she snapped. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the hallway to make sure Julian wasn't lurking nearby. "Listen to me. The hospital social worker is in her office until 5:00 p.m. I'm going to write a formal incident report about what I overheard in the hallway. That's a verbal directive of medical neglect by a proxy. It goes in the chart. It carries weight." I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. For months, I had been the only one who saw Julian's selfishness. Having a stranger, a professional, confirm it felt like the first breath of oxygen I'd had in weeks. It wasn't just me being emotional. It was a witnessed fact. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied. "You need to figure out how to stop him from blocking that surgery. If he has the power of attorney, the doctors have to listen to him unless a court or a higher authority says otherwise." She left the room, leaving me with the weight of the ticking clock. I sat back down on the edge of the bed and looked at my mother. I reached out and stroked her hand. It felt warmer than it had an hour ago. I looked at the monitor. Her heart rate was climbing, the little green spikes getting closer together. Suddenly, her hand twitched. I froze. "Mom!" Her eyes didn't snap open like in a movie. They fluttered, struggling against the weight of the sedation. She let out a soft, wet groan. I pressed the call button, my thumb shaking. Within seconds, a resident and Sarah were in the room. They adjusted the oxygen, checked the pupillary response, and started calling out numbers I didn't understand. 5 hours after Julian had stood in the hall and priced out her life, my mother opened her eyes. She couldn't speak clearly because of the tube, but she was conscious. She was present. The doctor explained that the crisis had peaked and her body was fighting back, but she was still in extreme danger without the procedure. They dimmed the lights and told me I could stay, but to keep her calm. When the room cleared, I leaned over the railing. My mother's eyes followed me. They were clouded with pain, but there was a spark of the woman who used to grade papers until midnight. She knew something was wrong. She could see the tear tracks on my face. "Julian is here," I whispered. I felt a pang of guilt, but I knew I couldn't protect her from the truth anymore. Protecting her from the truth was how Julian had managed to steal the $142,800. I took my phone out. I scrolled to the voice memo I had recorded. I hesitated for a second, wondering if this would kill her faster than the heart blockage. But then I remembered the bank statement. I remembered her teacher's pensions sitting in JM Holdings LLC. "Mom, you need to hear this," I said. I pressed play. I held the speaker right next to her ear. The recording started with the muffled sound of the ICU room, then the door opening. Then Julian's voice came through, crystal clear and sharp. "She is already old. Let's just keep her apartment. Why put her through the trauma? Just to drain the estate?" I watched her face, her eyebrows pulled together. Her hand, the one I was holding, tightened into a weak but definite grip. A single tear tracked through the hospital film on her cheek. She didn't look sad. She looked humiliated. And then she looked furious. She tried to lift her head, her chest heaving against the ventilator. I panicked, trying to settle her, but she pointed a trembling finger toward the bag where I kept the tablet. "I know, Mom," I said, the words spilling out of me. "I saw the bank transfer. He took the money. He took almost all of it." She made a sharp, guttural sound. She gestured for a pen. I grabbed a napkin from the tray and the pen Sarah had left on the bedside table. My mother's handwriting was usually elegant and precise. Now it was a jagged scrawl that tore through the paper. "No Julian," she wrote. Then, underneath it, in larger letters, Powers REVOKED. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a sudden, desperate strength. She wasn't the queen Julian had posted about on Instagram. She was a woman who had been betrayed by her firstborn, and she was done being an asset. I called Sarah back in. I showed her the napkin. "She's awake," I said, my voice finally steady. "And she wants to change her legal directives right now." Sarah looked at the paper, then at my mother. She nodded once, a sharp, professional movement. "I'll get the hospital notary and the social worker. We have an emergency provision for conscious patients to revoke proxy status if they're of sound mind. And looking at her right now, she looks very sound." Within 40 minutes, the room was crowded again. The social worker asked my mother a series of questions: her name, the date, who the president was. My mother answered them all with sharp nods and clear, written words. When they asked if she wanted Julian to remain her medical and financial proxy, she wrote never so hard the pen snapped. The notary stamped the paperwork. I was now the sole power of attorney. Julian was out. He was officially a visitor with no more authority than a stranger off the street. "Can we do the surgery now?" I asked the doctor. "The money is still an issue for the administration," he said, looking pained. "But with these new documents, we can at least lock in the intent." I looked at the paperwork. I looked at my mother, who had drifted back into a light, exhausted sleep. I had the legal power now, but Julian still had the cash. I had the recording, but the family still thought he was a saint. I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. The battle for her life was won in this room, but the battle for the truth was just beginning. Julian was still out there, probably planning which real estate agent to call first. He didn't know the estate had just woken up. The hospital notary left the room with a stack of signed papers, and for the first time in 6 months, the air felt thin enough to breathe. I held the new power of attorney forms like they were made of gold. I was no longer the emotional sister watching from the sidelines. I was the person in charge. But legal power doesn't pay hospital bills. I sat by the window and pulled up the bank records on the tablet again. $142,800. The number was a taunt. Julian had moved it into his LLC, thinking he was burying it in a corporate shell where I couldn't touch it. He hadn't counted on a conscious mother and an ICU nurse who was already filing a report of elder financial abuse. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone. I called the fraud department at Mom's bank. I spoke to a woman named Diane who sounded like she'd heard 1,000 stories of greedy children, but her tone shifted when I told her I had a signed revocation of POA and a hospital social worker ready to testify. We can place an administrative hold on the recipient account if we have proof of an unauthorized or coerced transfer, Diane said, especially with a pending medical emergency. I have the timestamp, I said, my voice steady. He moved it while she was being intubated. I have the audio of him admitting he wanted to keep her apartment instead of paying for her care. I spent 40 minutes uploading files. I sent the screenshot of the $142,800 transfer. I sent a scan of the new POA. I sent the recording of Julian's voice in the hallway, the part where he called her already old. By the time I hung up, Diane told me the funds in JM Holdings LLC were being frozen pending a formal investigation. Julian wouldn't be able to move a cent of that money back out. I felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. I wasn't just defending, I was dismantling him. I walked over to the nursing station. Sarah was there charting. She looked up and gave me a small, grim smile. Social worker talked to the surgical lead. They're putting her back on the 2:00 p.m. slot. The hospital is treating this as an emergency intervention now that the financial interference has been flagged. Thank you, I said, for everything. Don't thank me yet, she said, nodding toward the visitor lounge at the end of the hall. Your brother just walked back in. He's got your Aunt Linda and Uncle Pete with him. He's holding court. I looked down the long hallway. I could see them through the glass doors of the lounge. Julian was in the center of the room, sitting on the edge of a table. He was leaning forward, his head in his hands, performing the role of the exhausted, grieving son. My Aunt Linda was rubbing his back, her face twisted with pity. Uncle Pete was nodding solemnly. They thought they were there to support Julian through the hard decision of letting Mom go. They thought I was the one being difficult, the one who couldn't accept the inevitable. Julian had probably told them I was losing it, and that he was the only one looking out for the family's future. I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was a text from Julian to the family group chat, gathering in the ICU lounge for a difficult update on Mom. Please come if you can. We need to stand together as a family to do what's right for her. He was setting the stage. He wanted a gallery of witnesses when he officially authorized the move to hospice. He wanted everyone to see him being the brave leader so no one would ever question why he ended up with the apartment and the cash. He was walking right into the trap he'd spent years building. I looked back at my mother. She was sleeping, her chest moving with a slightly stronger rhythm now. The surgery was 3 hours away. I touched her hand one last time, then turned and walked toward the lounge. I didn't feel like the tired, invisible girl anymore. I felt like the storm Julian hadn't seen on the radar. I had the bank receipts. I had the recording. I had the nurse's statement. And most importantly, I had the truth that Julian was a thief who had tried to kill his mother for a real estate upgrade. As I pushed open the heavy glass doors to the lounge, the room went quiet. Aunt Linda looked at me with those sad, watery eyes. Oh, Clara, honey, Julian told us. It's okay to let go. You've done so much. Julian stood up, wiping his eyes with a silk handkerchief. He walked toward me, his arms open as if to give me a hug for the benefit of the room. "It's okay, Clara," he said softly. "I'll handle the doctors, you just sit down." "I'm not sitting down, Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. I saw Uncle Pete frown, confused by the tone. Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're stressed. Let's go talk in the hall." "No," I said, stepping back so he couldn't touch me. "We're going to talk right here, in front of everyone. You wanted a family update, didn't you? Let's give them the full story." I saw the first flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He looked at my phone, then back at my face. He still thought he was the smartest person in the room. He had no idea that the golden child was about to lose everything he'd stolen. The air in the visitor lounge was stale and smelled of burnt coffee. It was a room designed for quiet weeping and hushed voices, but Julian had turned it into a stage. My Aunt Linda was sitting on a low vinyl sofa, holding a crumpled tissue. Uncle Pete stood by the window, his arms folded over his chest, looking at me with a mix of pity and concern. Two of our cousins were in the corner, speaking in low tones. "Clara, honey," Aunt Linda said, her voice trembling. "Julian explained how hard this is for you. We know you've been the one doing the day-to-day. No one blames you for wanting to fight, but Julian says the doctors are concerned about her suffering." Julian stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, a silent command to stay quiet and follow the script. "It's okay, Aunt Linda. Clara just needs a minute. We're all exhausted." I stepped back, shaking his hand off. I didn't look at my aunt. I looked straight at Julian. He looked back, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. He was checking for weaknesses, looking for the crack that would let him regain control of the room. "I don't need a minute, Julian," I said. My voice was louder now, clear and resonant. "And the doctors aren't concerned about her suffering. They're concerned about the bill you refuse to pay." The room went silent. Uncle Pete shifted his weight, his brow furrowing. "What bill, Clara?" Julian said the insurance was handling the palliative transition. "There is no palliative transition," I said, walking to the center of the lounge. I felt like I was stepping onto a ledge, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the fall. "There is a life-saving surgery scheduled for 2:00 p.m., a surgery that Julian tried to cancel this morning because he didn't want to spend the money." "Clara, stop," Julian said, his voice dropping into that warning, paternal tone. "You're being erratic. You're confused by the medical jargon." "I'm not confused by the number $142,800, I replied. I saw Julian's face go pale. It was a quick, violent drain of color that he couldn't mask with a smile. He looked at Aunt Linda, then back at me, his mouth working silently for a second before he found his footing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, laughing nervously. "Uncle Pete, she's clearly hit a breaking point. Maybe we should call a nurse to get her a sedative." "I have the bank statement, Julian," I said. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I didn't show it to him yet. I held it up so the whole room could see it. "I have the record of the wire transfer you made to JM Holdings LLC 5 days ago. The day Mom was admitted, you emptied her savings while she was being intubated." Aunt Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Uncle Pete took a step toward us, his expression sharpening from concern to suspicion. He was a retired contractor. He knew what a shell company looked like. "Is that true, Julian?" Pete asked. "It's an estate management strategy." Julian snapped, his composure finally fraying at the edges. "I was protecting her assets from being seized by the hospital for end-of-life costs that won't even work. I'm the power of attorney. I have the legal right to manage those funds." "Not anymore," I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded, stamped papers from the hospital notary. I held them out toward Uncle Pete. "Mom woke up 5 hours ago," I said. The words felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. "She's conscious. She's alert, and the first thing she did was sign these. She revoked Julian's power of attorney. I'm in charge now." Julian lunged for the papers, but Uncle Pete was faster. He intercepted the document, adjusting his glasses to read the notary's seal. Julian stopped mid-stride, his chest heaving. He looked like a trapped animal, glancing toward the door, then back at the family. "She's medicated," Julian shouted. "She doesn't know what she's signing." "Clara, you're manipulating a dying woman to settle a grudge." "She's not dying, Julian," I said. "She's going into surgery in less than 3 hours, and the bank has already frozen your LLC account. They're treating that transfer as elder financial abuse." The word abuse hung in the air like a thick smoke. In our family, that word was a death sentence. We were people who showed up for Sunday dinners. We were people who looked after our own. Julian had spent his whole life building an image of the perfect, successful son who was the pillar of the family. That pillar was currently crumbling in front of the people who mattered most. "I did it for us," Julian said, turning to Aunt Linda, his voice cracking with a fake sob. "I did it to save the apartment. If the hospital takes everything, we have nothing left of her legacy. I was trying to save our home." "You were trying to save your commission," I said. "You told the doctor in the hallway that she was already old and we should just keep the apartment instead of paying for the surgery. You said it right outside her door." "I never said that," Julian hissed, his eyes wide and wild. "You're lying, you're making things up because you've always been jealous of me." He looked around the room, pleading with his eyes. "Aunt Linda, you know me, Pete. You know I'd never say something like that about Mom. Clara is she's just overwhelmed. She's hearing things." I looked at the smart TV mounted on the wall of the lounge. It was used for hospital announcements and relaxation videos, but it had a Bluetooth connection. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but my hands were steady. I knew exactly what I had to do. "I'm not hearing things, Julian," I said, "and neither was the nurse who dropped her clipboard when she heard you." I tapped the screen on my phone. The Bluetooth pairing request popped up on the TV. I saw Julian's eyes dart to the screen, then back to me. He realized what was happening a split second before the connection clicked. "Don't," he whispered. "Everyone," I said, looking at my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins. Julian wanted a family update. He wanted us to stand together, so let's listen to what he really thinks about our mother's life. I put my finger over the play button. Julian started toward me, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage, but Uncle Pete stepped in his way, putting a heavy hand on Julian's chest. "Let her play it, Julian," Pete said. His voice was like iron. "If it's a lie, you have nothing to worry about, right?" I pressed play. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the hospital's ventilation system and the static-filled beginning of the recording. We were at the threshold. In 10 seconds, the Julian they knew would be gone forever. The static on the TV speakers cleared, replaced by the hollow, echoing acoustics of the hospital corridor. At first, there was only the sound of a cart rattling in the distance and the faint, rhythmic whoosh of a ventilator from inside the room. Then, Julian's voice filled the lounge. It was amplified, vibrating against the thin drywall, stripping away the intimacy of the betrayal and making it a public fact. "She is already old," Julian's recorded voice said. Aunt Linda flinched as if she'd been slapped. She dropped her tissue, her mouth hanging open. She looked at the Julian standing in front of her, the one currently sweating through his expensive shirt, and then back at the TV. "She's had a good life. Why put her through the trauma of a surgery she might not survive just to drain the estate? Honestly, let's just keep her apartment." The recording continued for a few more seconds, capturing the sharp clack of the nurse's clipboard hitting the floor. Then my own voice, small but steady. "You're a monster." Julian's recorded reply was the final blow. "I'm a realist, Clara. Go get some coffee. You're becoming hysterical." I hit the stop button. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it's ringing in your ears. No one moved. My cousin Marco, who usually spent family gatherings joking around, was staring at Julian with a look of pure, unblinking horror. Julian's face had gone from pale to a mottled, angry red. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from person to person, looking for a single sympathetic face. He found none. Uncle Pete hadn't moved his hand from Julian's chest. He was just staring at him, his grip tightening until Julian's designer blazer began to bunch up. That's edited," Julian stammered. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry, desperate croak. "Clara, you're clever, I'll give you that. You took a private conversation about medical ethics and you chopped it up to make me look like a villain. You're trying to stage a coup because you want the apartment for yourself." "The nurse heard you, Julian," I said. "Her name is Sarah. She's at the station right now. She's already filed a report with the hospital social worker. She witnessed the whole thing." "She's in on it," Julian shouted, his voice cracking as he reached the pitch of true panic. "You probably paid her off with the money you're planning to steal from me. Aunt Linda, you know I've been paying Mom's property taxes for years. I've been the one managing the big picture." Aunt Linda stood up slowly. Her legs looked shaky, but her face was set in a way I'd never seen before. She walked over to Julian, stopping just inches away from him. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. "You were going to let her die," she whispered. "For a 3-bedroom apartment on 4th Street. Your own mother, Julian, the woman who worked 2 jobs to put you through that business school you're so proud of. I was protecting the family assets," Julian yelled, backing away until he hit the TV mounting. "If we spent $150,000 on a surgery for a woman who might not last a month, we'd have nothing. I was being the adult. I was making the hard call." "The hard call?" Uncle Pete's voice was low and dangerous. "Stealing $142,800 while she was unconscious is a hard call. That's not management, Julian. That's a felony. That's elder fraud." "I have the power of attorney," Julian screamed. He lunged toward the table where his briefcase sat, snapping it open. He fumbled with the latches, his hands shaking so violently he dropped a stack of papers. "I have the legal right. I'll sue this hospital. I'll sue Clara for defamation. I am the head of this estate." "You're nothing," I said. I stepped forward and placed the bank statement on the coffee table in front of Aunt Linda. "I called the bank, Julian. They've already flagged the transfer to your LLC. They've seen the revocation Mom signed an hour ago. You aren't the head of anything. You're a man who just got caught stealing from a dying woman." Julian looked at the bank statement, then at the faces of his family. He saw the way his cousins were looking at him, not with anger, but with a profound, soul-deep revulsion. He saw Aunt Linda turn her back on him. He realized then that the image was dead. He couldn't spin this. He couldn't talk his way out of a recording of his own voice. The polished, successful golden sun had been stripped bare, and all that was left was a small, greedy man who had priced out his mother's heartbeat. "Fine." Julian spat, his face twisting into a sneer that finally showed his true self. "Fine. You want to spend every cent on a lost cause? Go ahead, watch it all vanish. Watch the apartment go to the bank when you can't pay the taxes next year. I was the only one with a plan to keep this family afloat, and you've ruined it. You're all going to be broke, and you'll have her to thank for it." "Get out," Uncle Pete said. He took a step toward Julian, his hands balled into fists. "I'm leaving," Julian said, grabbing his briefcase. He tried to straighten his jacket, but he looked disheveled and small. "But don't call me when the bills start piling up. Don't call me for the funeral. You made your choice. You chose her over the future." "We chose a person over an asset, Julian," I said. He marched toward the door, trying to maintain some shred of dignity, but as he reached the handle, the glass doors swung open. 2 hospital security guards were standing there, accompanied by a woman in a professional suit. "Julian Sterling?" the woman asked. She held up a badge. I'm with Hospital Administration and Social Services. We've been notified of a potential case of elder financial exploitation involving a patient in our ICU. We need you to come with us to speak with the authorities." Julian froze. He looked at the guards, then back at us. He looked at me, and for 1 second I saw the pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. He didn't look like my brother. He looked like a stranger I'd met in a nightmare. "This is a mistake," Julian said, though his voice had lost its thunder. "My sister is unstable. She's—" "Mr. Sterling," one of the guards said, stepping into the lounge and placing a hand on Julian's arm. "Please come with us, now." They led him out. The room was silent again, but the air felt different. It felt lighter. Julian was gone, and with him went the suffocating pressure of his lies. Aunt Linda sat back down on the sofa and started to sob deep, racking sounds of grief for the nephew she thought she knew. Uncle Pete sat next to her, rubbing her shoulder, his eyes fixed on the floor. I stood in the center of the room, still holding my phone. My hands were finally still. Is she really going into surgery?" my cousin Marco asked quietly. "In 2 hours," I said. "The bank is reversing the transfer. Hospital is moving forward." "Can we see her?" Aunt Linda asked through her tears. "One at a time," I said. "She's tired, but she knows you're here." I walked out of the lounge and back toward the ICU. I passed the nursing station where Sarah was still working. She looked up and caught my eye. She gave me a single, slow nod. I didn't say anything, but I felt a deep, silent gratitude for the woman who had dropped her clipboard at the perfect moment. When I got back to Mom's room, it was quiet. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the floor. I sat in the chair by her bed and took her hand. She was still sleeping, but her color was better. The grayness was fading, replaced by a faint, healthy flush. I thought about the apartment. I thought about the $142,800. Julian was right about one thing. It was going to be hard. There would be bills and taxes and a long recovery. We wouldn't be rich in the way he wanted to be. But as I watched my mother's chest rise and fall, I realized that I had already won the only thing that mattered. I had my mother back, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a brother looming over me, telling me what I was worth. I leaned my head against the railing of the bed and closed my eyes. I was exhausted, but for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't afraid of the morning. The surgery took 4 hours. I sat in the waiting room with Aunt Linda and Uncle Pete. We didn't talk about Julian. We talked about Mom's garden. We talked about the time she took us all to the beach and Julian, even then, had refused to get his shoes sandy. We laughed quietly, and it felt like we were clearing out the cobwebs of a decade of favoritism. At 7:00 p.m., Dr. Aris walked into the waiting room. He was smiling. "She's in recovery," he said. "The blockage is cleared. Her heart is strong." "She's a fighter, Clara." "I know," I said. I went to see her an hour later. She was groggy from the anesthesia, but when she saw me, she reached out her hand. I squeezed it, and she squeezed back, a firm, conscious grip. "It's over, Mom," I whispered. "The surgery went perfectly, and Julian is gone. He's not coming back." She closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. She looked peaceful. I stayed with her all night. I didn't need the phone recording anymore. I didn't need the bank statements or the legal papers. All I needed was the sound of her breathing. The apartment keys were still in my pocket. They felt heavy, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of a home that was still ours. It was the weight of a life that hadn't been traded for a bank balance. I knew there would be a trial. I knew the family would have to deal with the fallout of Julian's arrest and the shame of the scandal. I knew people in our community would whisper. But as I watched the sun rise over the city the next morning, I didn't care about the whispers. I didn't care about Julian's legacy. I only cared about the woman in the bed who was currently opening her eyes and looking at me with a soft, tired smile. "Hi, Mom," I said. "Clara," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I realized then that the golden child hadn't been Julian. It had been the truth. It just took a long time to find its way into the light. I spent the rest of the morning helping the nurses move her to a regular room. Every person I encountered, the orderlies, the janitors, the other nurses, seemed to know what had happened. News travels fast in a hospital, especially news about a family showdown in the lounge. They treated me with a new kind of respect. I wasn't just the tired daughter anymore. I was the one who had fought the giant and won. By noon, the room was filled with flowers, real ones, sent by the cousins and neighbors, not the performative lilies Julian had bought. The smell of the room changed from sterile chemicals to roses and lilies. I sat by the window and looked out at the street below. I saw a black car pull up to the entrance, and for a second my heart skipped a beat, thinking it was Julian coming back to cause more trouble. But it wasn't him. It was just a stranger. Julian was in a cell or a lawyer's office or a halfway house of his own making. He was no longer a factor in our lives. He was just a ghost in a navy suit. I picked up my phone and saw 100 notifications. The family group chat was exploding. Some people were angry, some were confused, but most were just relieved. They had all felt the off energy from Julian for years, but they had been too afraid to say anything because of how much Mom adored him. Now the spell was broken. I didn't reply to any of them. I just put the phone face down on the table. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. The recording had done all the talking for me. I looked at my mother, who was watching a morning news program, her hand reaching for a sip of water. I got up to help her, and as I did, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since I was a child. We were going to be okay. The apartment was safe. The money was being returned. And most importantly, the truth was out. Julian had wanted to keep the apartment. He ended up with nothing but a ruined reputation and a court date. I wanted to keep my mother, and I did. That was the only asset that ever mattered. The legal process moved with a cold, mechanical speed that Julian never saw coming. Because the hospital's social worker and the bank's fraud department had already flagged the transfer, the state took over the heavy lifting. I didn't have to sue him. The district attorney did. Elder financial exploitation is a serious charge, and with a recorded admission of medical neglect and a paper trail of a wire transfer to a shell company, there wasn't much room for his high-priced lawyers to maneuver. Julian's perfect reputation didn't just crack, it shattered. Once the story hit our local community, the clients at his firm started dropping him. It turns out people don't want to trust their asset protection to a man who tried to harvest his mother's savings while she was on a ventilator. He reached out to me once, a week before his hearing, with a long, rambling email blaming me for destroying the family name. I didn't reply. I just forwarded it to the prosecutor. Mom came home 6 weeks after the surgery. The apartment was quiet when we walked in. It didn't feel like a legacy or a real estate transaction. It just felt like home. I spent the afternoon opening the windows to let out the stale air and making a pot of tea. Mom sat in her favorite armchair by the window, the one Julian had probably already mentally priced for an estate sale. She looked out at the street, her hands resting calmly on a patchwork quilt. "It's good to be back, Clara," she said. Her voice was thin, but the strength was returning. "It is," I said. I looked at her, and I realized I didn't feel the old resentment anymore. I wasn't the invisible helper. I wasn't the unpaid help. I was the woman who had stood in the gap when everyone else was looking away. I didn't need Julian's validation, and I certainly didn't need the family's praise. I had the quiet, steady knowledge that I had done right by the person who mattered most. Sometimes, I still find myself checking my phone for a recording, a habit from those frantic days in the ICU. But then I look over and see Mom grading a few papers for the local tutoring center or tending to the herbs on her windowsill. The $142,800 was returned to her account, minus some legal fees, and it's more than enough to keep her comfortable for the rest of her life. Julian is currently serving a suspended sentence with heavy restitution and a permanent restraining order regarding Mom's finances. He's moved to another state, trying to rebuild a life where no one knows his name. I hope he finds whatever it is he's actually looking for, but I know it won't be found in a bank balance. Yesterday, we sat on the balcony as the sun went down. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. It was the same grip she had in the hospital, firm, conscious, and full of a truth that didn't need words. We don't talk about Julian much. We talk about the future. Blood makes you related, but it's what you do in the dark that makes you family. What would you have done if you heard your sibling say something like that in a hospital hallway? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have hit record? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I've seen some of you mention stories where a golden child finally gets what's coming to them. I'll be sharing another one of those soon about a sister who tried to sell her parents' house while they were on vacation. If you believe in standing up for those who can't speak for themselves, hit that subscribe button and join us. Until next time, take care of each other.